conceptualize crime and define crime. And then the second chapter was about the criminal justice system and how that operates in our, in our culture and our society. So to start off with defining and understanding what is crime, we need to define it. So, let's see, I'm going to take a step back here. So to start off with our social building blocks in social life, the basic building blocks that we use to organize our lives are called norms. Norms are a group's generally agreed upon rules and expectations for behavior. Let's see. I have a dog, and there's a dog hair in my mask, and it has been making my nose itch this whole time. Excuse me. Picking my nose in public, that's deviant. Okay. Much better. Norms are a group's generally agreed upon rules and expectations for behavior. So these can be formal, like laws, right? Where they're not just generally agreed upon. We voted or elected representatives who are supposed to represent us to write these laws, right? But they can be laws. But there can also be generally agreed upon rules and expectations for behavior that aren't formal laws. I mentioned picking your nose a second ago, right? That you should not pick your nose in public is a generally agreed upon expectation, but it's not written down anywhere except a kindergarten classroom wall or something, right? So norms are our rules. When you fail to follow a norm, that's called deviance. Deviance is breaking any social norm, the law side of things or the nose-picking kind of informal side of things. And as a culture, the way we deal with deviance is to apply sanctions. Sanctions are societal reactions to deviance. You might think of sanctions as like a negative, we have economic sanctions against Iran or something like that. But sanctions can technically be positive or negative, right? You can have rewards, right? Like sanctions can be trying to get people to follow the norms, or they can be punishments if you don't follow the norms. Doesn't matter. Sanctions are the reactions that we get. Our different norms in society have differing amounts of importance, right? Again, nose-picking on a scale of that to murder, right? Very different. So the more informal, slightly less serious norms are usually called folkways. Breaking a folkway often results in a mild sanction. If you went out in public and picked your nose, you'd probably get, people looking grossed out at you, or maybe they'd roll their eyes, or tisk or something, right? You would probably get some mild punishment for doing it, right, socially. But that's it. You can go about your day and live just fine, right? Mores, on the other hand, it looks like the word is mores, but it's pronounced mores. Mores are norms that are specific to our moral and ethical behaviors. So, folkway might be something like, standing too close to somebody, right? They're, getting in their personal bubble. But mores are violations of more serious moral or ethical behaviors, and they tend to result in more harsh negative sanctions. So, for example, in our society, there's a moray against overt racist behavior, right? And if you violate that, while it's not illegal, it can result in social penalties, right? Judgment from others, people, refusing to hang out with you anymore, other kinds of sanctions from society, even if it's not technically illegal, right? And then finally, we have taboos. And taboos are the most serious of all rules. Breaking a taboo could result in not just a sanction, but could result in anything as far as expulsion from society, either through death or through, exile, right? Some taboos are things like cannibalism. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think.
A lot of sexual ones, necrophilia.
Sure, absolutely, yes. Various sexual taboos. And again, they don't always result in automatic expulsion from society, but they are very strictly enforced and sanctioned, right? I think you get the idea. There's a scale here, right? Nose picking to necrophilia. Alliteration. If you need to remember them, just think of those two things, you'll be fine. Do these make sense? Folkways, mores, taboos, and they, increasing seriousness. All right. So that brings us to crime. Crime is a very specific kind of norm violation, right? It's not breaking any norm, it's breaking a law. So crime is defined as an intentional act in violation of the law and penalized by the state. I don't mean the state of Maine. State here is a general term to mean government, right? An intentional act in violation of the law and penalized by the state.
What about the unintentional act?
Right. So it is true that in our criminal justice system, ignorance of the law is not a defense, right? But in the sociological construction of crime, intent matters. And intent does matter in certain crimes, right? Murder, for example.
I'm thinking more like involuntary manslaughter.
Right. So
not an intentional, but it's still a crime.
Or certain trespassing if you didn't realize you were
That's when the ignorance comes in. But
right. Correct.
Driving resulting in the death when you crash into.
Right. You are still liability is still
There's no intention involved in that.
That is true. So the intent doesn't have to be to break a law, but the behavior you engage in is still intentional. Like you're still intentionally driving your car drunk, or do you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
No, I got you.
yeah. So you're right. The intent doesn't have to be I'm going to break this rule or whatever, but the act, like if you were kidnapped and forced to shoot somebody, you're not. Do you know what I mean? Like you're.
So in this case, intention is not so much in the meaning behind it, is in that you were an active participant in what's
In the
going on.
behavior, yes.
Okay.
At least that's my understanding. I want to state for the record I'm not a legal scholar, but yes.
Is intent as premeditate?
Intent is what? I'm so sorry, Mimi.
As the same thing as premeditated when you plan ahead that you're going to do it?
Not exactly. It's very close, yeah. Intentional means you want to do the thing. You're choosing to do the thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is definitely not a legal definition because intentional, in this case, premeditated, intentional in this definition are not safe.
Correct.
And, talking about manslaughter depends. There's different degrees depending on, was it drunk driving? Was it felonious manslaughter turns into murder sometimes in some states? Sometimes it doesn't. So from a legal standpoint, this does not even scratch the surface of legal definitions to be.
Intent is a whole legal category.
Yeah,
right?
So,
Yes.
so this is not even close. Premeditated would be like the most direct form of intent.
Yes, I have
There's a
planned
lot
this
more-
activity,
There's a
but
lot more underneath intent. Like you said with drunk driving, you don't intend to kill somebody, but you did intend to drive your vehicle drunk and you killed somebody in the process.
right.
That's a different intent, but it's still by the legal definition, it's intent.
Right. Correct. So a criminology class would make you want to know that, right? Our class, all I'm trying to distinguish is between this and deviance, right? I hear you guys, and I don't want to be
That's what
accurate.
I kind of, because it sounds like people are going more towards the legal, and it's
Right.
definitely not illegal.
Right.
This is the active. The crime did not happen to you.
Right.
You took
You
some
played a
action
role in it happening.
resulted in the crime.
Yes. And that's the idea, right? Is that if you were in a coma and somehow you fell out of bed and crushed somebody's foot, that's not an intentional act. It's gravity. I really can't think of a good, counterexample, but yes. I would focus on the fact that crime is the violation of the law, not just a norm, and it's punished, it's penalized, sanctioned, right, by the state, by the government. Deviant behavior, remember that's just any norm violation. Deviant behavior can become criminal behavior if the norm being violated is formalized. The legal term here is codified. Deviant behavior can become criminal behavior if the norm being violated is formalized or codified into law. So we could write a law that says no picking your nose, right? And suddenly a deviant behavior will become a criminal behavior. The interesting thing here is the burden, not legal burden necessarily, but philosophical burden, is on the government, is on the state, to indicate that a particular act will not be allowed, right? They have to say, this isn't okay and don't do this thing, for it to be a law and for your violation of it to be a crime. The government has to declare the act a crime before they can punish somebody for it. Okay. This kind of brings me to the next point, which is, who gets to decide what is a law and what isn't a law, right? And the answer is people in power. Power in society gets to define crime or criminality or the way they're viewed, right? We have this idea in society that criminals is a group of people and they're different than us, right? That somehow there are these two, good law-abiding people and these other people, and it creates an us versus them mentality that's often not reflective of reality. Those with the most power in society have the most say in what or whom society deems criminal, right? And because they have that power, they can, and sometimes do, manipulate the way we view crime and criminals. Again, by framing it as an us versus them kind of thing, it creates, division among people, in the same social class, for example, right? It's, we're both poor, but I'm a law-abiding person. I'm not a criminal, right? And it creates that sort of conflict, right? Questions about that? I have more on the next slide explaining why, but so people in power have the most say in what our laws are. Now, why does this matter? Well, it gets a little philosophical here, right? So there's a philosophical principle called the Thomas Theorem. The Thomas Theorem says that situations defined as real are real in their consequences. Situations defined as real are real in their consequences. In other words, if people think something is true, then they will act as if it's true. Right? If people, in the case of social problems, if people think there's a social problem and an issue, they will act as if it's true. So if I truly believe that dragons are out there and they are a threat to me, it doesn't matter if dragons are real. If I believe they're real, I'm going to act as if they are real. And if everybody in society believes that dragons are real, again, it still doesn't matter if dragons are real. Everybody's going to act like dragons are real. The social reality is dragons are real. Does that make sense? I know it's a little abstract, but because, yes, Brenda.
Of course, everybody knows dragons are real.
Okay, fair. Yes.
I know this. I know they're real.
Komodo dragon. There's probably
Bearded dragons.
bearded dragons, right? Fair enough.
Puff the Magic.
Puff the Magic. There you go. Touche. But yes. But to my point, right, that if people think something is real, if they think there is a threat to them, they're going to behave like that's a threat, right? So it doesn't actually matter if the threat exists. You still have to deal with the fact that people are acting like it is, right?
Perception is reality.
Perception is reality, and that is the sociological truth. All that matters is what you think is real. That
Literally the number one phrase in the military system is reality.
Yeah.
That all.
they're not wrong.
It doesn't matter what you were doing. It matters what people think you were doing.
Fair enough. And therein lies the moral and ethical conundrum, right? That people can take this fact and manipulate it if they so choose. I'm not saying everybody does this, but so the book talks about a group of people called claims makers. Claims makers. What they mean is people who make claims about crime, right? People who make claims about crime, sometimes purposefully, sometimes accidentally, misuse statistics or the media, resulting in real-world consequences. I don't know if you guys know about this pandemic that's going on right now. Yeah. So there have been instances across the board of claims makers, especially on the internet, making claims, misusing statistics or the media, and that has resulted in real-world consequences. It's resulted in illness and death and economic downturns and job, displacement. All sorts of social problems have been created as a result of misuse of active data and the media. The media is both a tool and responsible for some of it too, right? But I want to keep talking about how things get misused. But does that make sense that it matters because it becomes reality if people believe it? Okay, good. So, because crime is socially constructed, because we define what it is and we create it and all that, it's subject to human error, meaning people make mistakes all the time when they make claims about crime. So, for example, the crime rate is not stable over time. The crime rate has changed over time, but concern about crime has remained stable over time. In other words, people's concern about crime has been steady, even in the face of evidence that crime is actually decreasing significantly across the United States. So I'll let you guys write that down. Then I have some graphs to illustrate this. But so think about stranger danger. You guys remember stranger danger as a kid, right? You teach kids don't talk to strangers, don't get in stranger's car, all that kind of stuff. The most likely person to hurt or assault a child is almost always someone they know. It is not a stranger. Stranger danger is not as big of a danger as most other dangers, right? But we have this conception as a society that these masked people are going around abducting children willy-nilly, right? And has it happened before? Yes. But the reality isn't stranger danger, right? It's acquaintance, schmaintance, whatever. So here is a graph of public perception about crime for about 17 years. It starts off really, really, really high because it was in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. So if you would, start with me here, right? And from here on, you can see it's gone up and down, but that the average has been fairly steady. About 45% of people are worried a great deal about crime. And even if it's volatile a little bit here with up and down bumps and whatever, you see the shape here, right? Maybe an L, but a long straight line. Here is a graph of the violent crime rate over the exact same period of time. Right? The violent crime rate has been steadily going down significantly over the last 20 years. With, again, it's data, it's going to fluctuate, it goes up a little, comes back down again, right? So people are worried about crime but their worries have not correlated with the actual reality of crime. Does that kind of make sense? And so public worry about crime seems to bear almost no relationship to actual crime. Why are people so worried about crime if it's going down?
Focus on
The media.
focus on ratings and selling the serious thing because it makes the most sell.
We had a black president, although it seems like actually went down.
Yeah. But right, there's stereotypes, right?
I think the media
It's quicksand.
Yeah.
It's quicksand.
It's the quicksand idea again, right? We were told to be afraid of it, so we're afraid of it, right?
Yeah. I always thought quicksand was going to be a much bigger problem in my life than it really
Me too.
Agreed.
They're still doing it to this day.
We're totally terrified of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, there's always this very special episode, and somebody falls in the quicksand, and they immediately sink. And yes, absolutely, right? This doesn't sell newspapers, right? This doesn't get clicks. This makes everybody feel good. We want people to feel anxious so they will keep reading, right? And so the media is a huge part of this problem. There's this concept called wound culture, which is kind of used to describe the media fascination with violent crime in U.S. society. There's a little more of a crass statement that's used. If it bleeds, it leads, right? You know, the idea that the media sensationalizes violence, death, destruction, right? We say the media is fascinated with it, but what they're really fascinated with is the ratings of everybody else being fascinated with it and watching, right? And so this becomes very significant because every time you turn the news on, the main stories are, fire or death or destruction. Even if that's a 1 in a 100 activity that happens, it's the one that they put on the news that night, right? They don't put the 90 stories where everything was great. Or they do the one, but they do it at the end, right? Where a puppy was rescued from a tree or whatever, And so this is a big part of why their perception is much higher than the reality of crime. Not to mention how the crime is depicted, right? So the media are much more likely to depict people of color committing crimes. And if you think about the general public, right, constantly viewing images of black men committing violent acts can create an association in your brain between black men and criminality that results in fear or anxiety towards black men, right? It's literally a conditioning process psychologically of your brain. This concept is called implicit bias. Implicit bias. Attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Every single one of us has implicit biases. It is a psychological fact that our brain works by creating shortcuts and making assumptions and literally stereotyping. That's what your brain does. Just having biases isn't necessarily a problem, as long as you know about that, right? So if you are constantly exposed again to, media images of black men committing violent crime, you may develop an implicit bias that associates black men with crime. The same thing goes for, bias between eating Italian food and feeling really feeling really satisfied, right? Like, if you eat a lot of Italian food and enjoy it, you're going to create a connection in your mind between those two things. But we know the media is constantly showing us violence. They're constantly distorting who they show committing violence. And so we all develop these implicit biases over time. In fact, there is a huge amount of study devoted to understanding and uncovering implicit biases. One version of this are called shooter studies. Shooter studies are a series of research conducted, across disciplines and across time, but where participants are shown images of black men and white men, either holding a gun or holding a cell phone. And the idea is you're shown this picture and you have less than a second to respond. You have to choose like shoot or don't shoot. You pretend you're a cop, right? So you get an image of a man holding something, and you have to quickly determine whether it's a dangerous issue or a safety issue, right? Or a safe issue. So, for example, here are some of the images that are very small. Don't worry, but you get right. So this flashes on your screen. You get a picture of a person, and they're holding something. As you can see, they are varied based on there's different races shown and whether they're holding a gun or a cell phone. What we find is that participants consistently shoot armed black men faster than armed white men. So people make the decision to shoot faster if it's a person of color. And they shot more unarmed black men than unarmed white men. So when they make a mistake, it's more likely in the direction of shooting an unarmed black man rather than an unarmed white man, meaning they give the benefit of the doubt more often to white men. So this is some of the data from a shooter study that I linked to on Brightspace. So in this graph, it's the reaction time that a person takes before, milliseconds or something like that, right? And so when the subject was unarmed, they waited longer before shooting the black man, right? Whereas when the subject was armed, they gave more time to decide whether to shoot the white man. This one over here is the errors that they make. So people are more likely to shoot an unarmed person if they're black rather than white. And people are more likely to not shoot an armed person if they're white rather than if they're black. Again, you can look at the article I posted for more details on this specific study. But our activity today is actually going to be you taking your own implicit bias test. So I'm going to walk you through how to do this, and then you can do it after class or whatever. But so this comes from Harvard University's Project Implicit, and it'll help you understand the methods behind these shooter studies, and you'll also examine your own implicit biases. You will not be required to reveal the results of your test, implicit bias test to me or to anyone. So hang on one second. Let me just bring over the Brightspace page to show you how this works. So I'm on today's module, right? And you go down to the participation assignment, and you click on it, not right below it. So in order to do this, you're going to click on this link that'll take you to, I already opened it, Harvard University's Project Implicit. When you click on it, you're going to get what's called the informed consent. It just explains what's going to happen to your data, that this isn't supposed to hurt you in any way to take this test. So you scroll down to the bottom, please read it, but then click I wish to proceed. And then there's a whole bunch of different IATs. IATs are implicit association tests. I'm going to ask you to take the one called weapons IAT. Weapons IAT, but if for some reason you reach a technical glitch with this, sometimes they're uploading new data and it is down, you can take any of the other ones. But I would like us to focus on the weapons one if possible. And so you click on that, and there's some demographic info. I didn't have to do this earlier. What the heck? Okay, so...
It was quite in depth, including this.
No. Alright, I'm just going to do... I just did this earlier. Oh, here it is, decline to answer. Let's just speed it up. So what happens is... Come on, guys. Nope, not you. I'm sorry, I'm trying to... Where's the... I'm in the way of the do not answer, aren't I? Okay, we'll say undo. I'm not going to submit this, so it's not going to mess with their data. Sorry, I did do this earlier. I apologize, guys. Okay. Okay, let's just fetch. Never. Okay, this is where it took me the first time I put. But so you're going to see images. These are the things that they're considering harmless objects. These are the things they consider weapons. These are the people classified as Black Americans, the people classified as white Americans. And the idea is when you start, you hit go, and you put one finger on the E key, one finger on the I key, just, it's two, one for each hand. And if you know, if you want to shoot, you know, you hit the one, and if you don't shoot, the other. Right? So you're going to do that, and it doesn't start. Hang on. Thanks, guys. There. So, like, do you shoot or not shoot? Is it dangerous or is it not dangerous, right? All right, classify by race, right? So is this person black or white, right? I'm just randomly picking like the same one over and over again.
It won't let you continue if you press the right one.
Yeah,
There we go. See, you guys already did this?
I did it.
All right. So anyway, you do a bunch of faces, you do a bunch of weapons, and it looks to see whether you are making associations between race and weapons. I apologize for this failure of a demonstration, but it's not that bad. Well, and you have the option to answer about whether you think it was. So, the questions that it asks you are, have you ever heard anyone making claims about crime? Who was it? What do you think they were trying to achieve with their claim? How do most people do on the IAT? You'll find out the answer to this when you finish, which is why I was trying to get through it quickly, because they give you the screen at the end with your results, but then, like, here's the summary of the data, right? So make sure you don't, like, click away on that last screen. You know, take a screenshot or something real quick, just in case. How can you relate this finding, the finding about how most people do on the IAT, to what you learned in the chapter about how we represent criminality? And do you have any concerns with how the IAT works? And there's discussions about how that works. I'm not an idiot, I know.
It's gonna be a long.
So, well, you know, participation. So do what you feel you must. Yes.
It's gonna be a long answer.
That's fine. So, does it make sense what I'm asking you to do, even though my, you know, saying it's going to be real quick and then clicking on it made me answer 20 questions, but I wish to proceed. Weapons, that's not clear. And it changes the order every time, so weapons. Nope, it did it again with the demographics. But anyway, take that test. Let me know in your assignment what you thought about it. You do not have to give me your results. I don't care what your results were. You just need to talk about how it relates to what people think about crime. Does that make sense? All right. Back to today's thing and to the PowerPoint. So, one mistake that gets made in claims construction is this over-reliance on, wounds and blood and violence and crime, right? Another way people make mistakes when talking about crime is to misrepresent statistics, right? A common strategy that we use to convince people about an issue is to make a numerical claim about how widespread an issue is, right? To say, did you know that 5 out of 10 Americans will face this problem? Or did you know that, you know, the violent crime rate has increased 4% this year? Or whatever, you know, they use numbers, right? The thing about crime is it's crime, right? Like, it's by its nature, it's not going to be easy to report and easy to measure, right? It happens, you know, in the shadows kind of thing. Many criminal acts are unreported or not discoverable. And what happens is people capitalize on this fact that we can never have a perfect idea of how much and what kind of crime exists by saying we can't have any idea about crime and what is and what isn't with crime, right? They take this idea of this dark figure of crime, meaning the amount of information we don't know about crime, and they spin it as a way that we can't know anything about crime. Does that make sense? So this is data that doesn't show up in official crime statistics, so there is no proof in any direction about what it is and what it shows, right? And so it can be manipulated in any direction. Yeah.
I think it's also important to know that anyone who's taken a statistics class knows how easy it is to skew the numbers to make them say what you want them to say. without cheating.
Right,
And
being-
without lying or falsifying anything, there are ways to skew the
interpret,
numbers to
yeah.
show what you want them to show.
Right.
The other issue I see a lot of times, especially when we go trying to just look up statistics on, recently about the smartphone and internet penetration statistics, the usage in countries that was growing. They change how they collect that data
Yeah.
more what counts as internet usage versus social media usage versus this every year. And
Right.
statistics never stay the same.
Yeah, you can't compare one to the
So,
other.
like for violent crime, what's defined as a violent crime this particular year? Or,
Right.
You know, so it really, you know, sometimes it was robbery was included, you know, petty theft was included in violent crime. And sometimes it's not. Because, oh, well, petty theft doesn't necessarily mean you have to testify.
Right. And the FBI has one definition, and local police precincts have others, and right,
The
so.
definitions change every so often.
Yeah.
So it's not as just as simple as saying,
This is how much crime there is.
Yeah.
Right, and that's true, and I don't think most researchers they know that, they admit that readily, right, but people can take advantage of this unknown quantity of data, right, and make any claim they want about it. So that's where we run into some of these issues, where you know, mistakes are made. So let me show you how we try to deal with that. It's not perfect by any means, but there are two main sources of this data about crimes, at least nationally speaking. So the first one is called the Uniform Crime Report. It is released by the FBI every year. It includes information about what they classify as Part 1 and Part 2 crimes. Part 1 crimes are 4 violent crimes: homicide, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery. Always those 4. Part 2 crimes are, I'm so sorry. Part 1 is those 4 violent crimes and 4 property crimes: burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. All of those 8 are Part 1, and then Part 2 crimes are like 21 other crimes. Embezzlement, fraud, vagrancy, drunkenness are the 4 I know, but there are more there. Why they make that distinction, I don't know. But they do keep the 8 Part 1 crimes the same for the purpose you were describing before, which is we need to be able to compare them. The FBI produces this report, but it is drawn on data from all levels of government, federal, state, and local agencies. However, it's drawn from these agencies, right, from police departments. So it only reflects reported crime. It's never admitted to report anything else. Like, it's always been, oh, this is reported crimes. And so this is the first place that most researchers go for data on crime, like comprehensive national data on crime, unreported crime. Fair enough. I'm not going to test you, of course, on what's Part 1 and what's Part 2, I promise. I don't even know. I had to look it up. I had it written down. But I do want you to know, like, Uniform Crime Report is the FBI, it's annual, and it's reported crime. So, obviously, there's a huge shortfall here, which is what about unreported crime? So in the 70s, I think it was 73, I don't know, it's on here somewhere the year, but we developed, the country, developed something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS. And in this survey, it's done just of people, of everybody, asking them, hey, have you ever been the victim of a crime? Right? And so they gather information on whether a crime was reported. So they say, have you ever been the victim of a crime? Did you report it? Right? And so people could say, yeah, I was mugged once and I didn't report it. That is now a piece of evidence that's not in the UCR, but that, could theoretically be used to help estimate crime. Experiences with the criminal justice system, self-protective measures used, whether they thought there might be possible substance abuse or use by the offenders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they ask people about their experiences on the other side of crime. However, the NCVS only covers 6 different crimes. I used to know the list. It's the major crimes like assault, murder. Well, you can't ask somebody if they've ever been the victim of murder, but Yeah. You can ask them if they have been, known someone who's the victim of murder. Yeah. And it's not all violent crime. There's, have you ever been the victim of theft and things too? So I can't remember what the 6 are off the top of my head. But so this is from the Department of Justice, and they ask people to indicate if they've ever experienced them, but it doesn't require that the crime has been reported. And so if you compare some of the data based between the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, and the NCVS, you can see the numbers are extremely higher for the NCVS, right? That in 2017 there were about 1.3 million, 1.2 million reported crimes in the UCR, but over 5.5 million crimes reported in the NCVS, right? So there is evidence that the NCVS is bringing something to the table more than just the UCR does, but obviously only 6 crimes are covered here, and there's a whole lot of other things that aren't being measured still. Like, this is by no means solving the problem, but it is clearly something that's helping gather more information. In fact, once this NCVS was first released, 73, I knew there was early 70s. After the first National Crime Victimization Survey was released, it revealed a huge lack of trust by the average citizen in the legal system. Because we were seeing that, there's this many reported crimes and then so many more that weren't reported. And that indicated a lack of trust, that people didn't trust the system to work, so they never even reported crimes. And it spurred 2 social movements. The first was the victims' rights movement, which used the statistics in the NCVS to point out that victims had low levels of trust, and that resulted in lower levels of crime reporting and crime solving. Right? If people aren't reporting crimes, you can't solve or even possibly prevent crime. The other is what was then called the battered women's movement, which, because in the first NCVS there was a huge rate of unreported sexual assault and domestic violence. Right? The difference between the UCR results on domestic violence and the NCVS were astronomically different. And so it resulted in this movement to empower and support and protect victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. That being said, data that leads to successful claims making about social problems can also be misused. Right? Problem promoters can use overinflated statistics, like you were talking about before, something that can stoke emotions. Right, and so as anyone who studies statistics knows, you can manipulate them. So just because we have better data on crime than we used to doesn't mean that the problem is gone, right? Questions or comments about this? All right.
I have a question about the NCVS survey. Does that also include survey questions about demographics?
It does.
Okay.
It does.
That's what I was going to just because of the whole.
Oh wait, demographics of the victim or of
The victim.
what they perceive of their perpetrator?
Or the perpetrator, that matters.
I do believe that people are also asked about their perceptions if they know about the perpetrator. Like
Their own demographics.
could you tell if they were around
It's a lot
substance?
harder to demonstrate. Like, say, for instance, battered women's movement, it'd be hard to demonstrate if there was the domestic violence of a woman issue or a men's issue. The men are less likely to report it as well if the woman's hitting them because of stigma.
Right.
So it'd be
And in
proof of one or the
1973,
other
yeah.
if you weren't asking that question. So I was just making sure that was the question that I assumed it was.
I know it is now, but it's fair to say I don't know if it was in 1973, and I certainly think in 1973 the assumption would have been domestic violence only affects women.
Exactly.
So,
And that's kind of a curious question I had on that. Was
Yeah.
If it wasn't, maybe.
Just in the other, yeah.
Yeah, 'cause I would assume that
Yeah.
that'd be important.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it always has, but even if the data in 1973 said, oh, men and women are equally likely to be like, or even more likely, men are more likely to not report, I don't think they would have seen that. Do you know what I mean? Like, clearly, because it was called the battered women's movement. But to your point, yes, that is a clear piece of data that's needed, right? So yeah, definitely. Oh, especially like your perceptions of things?
Yeah, you're asking someone if they thought the perpetrator was on drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Correct.
Because now you have that another survey that talks about, drug-related crime.
Right.
They're going to trump that now.
Hopefully they won't, because that's not what it's measuring. But yes, I mean, it's measuring what people think they thought they saw. But I hear you. It can be, that can also be misused.
It also comes down to the demographics.
Right.
With the black man.
Right. Oh yeah, it was definitely a person of color.
No, he was a very light skinned. Turned out the guy was Hispanic.
Right.
Like there's a lot of opinion based for a scientific study that's awful opinion.
That's fair. And so what I would say, just in its defense, I suppose, is that what its goal is to measure is a victim's experiences, not perfect accuracy. Like it's it's not meant to be a perfect representation of what happened.
Absolutely. I think where the problem's coming down for me
Yeah.
is the fact that people make the worst witnesses.
Absolutely.
So did you get mugged or were you pickpocketed?
Right.
There's a difference.
Absolutely.
And
Not to mention, what color shirt was the person wearing, and you get 3 answers from 3 different people, and yeah.
It's going to be something, I know it's stereotypical,
Right.
but like
Those implicit biases come out.
when you get like a man who was pickpocketed, he's not going to report that, and if he's asked about it, it's going to become a lot bigger than it actually was.
Right.
Because he doesn't want to be that guy that got pickpocketed.
Right.
So all of a sudden they had a gun, they had it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So what I would say, and I hear you, is I guess the question that is facing researchers is it better to have some information that's not perfect, or to not do the survey at all and then just have to rely on the reported, or you know what I mean? Like I agree. I think what you're saying is this can be improved, and that 100%. But I think the idea that it's still going on, even with opinion and perception questions, is it's better to have some of this data than none of this data. I think that's a personal researcher's opinion kind of a thing, but an absolutely fair critique for sure.
And I have the even question that stating it's just a lack of trust in these sources itself, maybe how, more so because how you phrase it.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's a lot of, this, I'm saying 73 would be more, if it was men that weren't reporting crime, that would be the stigma of, I don't want to report the crime, I'm supposed to get a guy, I'm not supposed to get robbed, I'm not supposed to get mugged, I'm not supposed to, have those things happen to me. Or, even more so, it's just a matter of, I guess it's not a lack of trust per se, but it's knowing that they don't have any evidence. Like, this happened, and there's no evidence of who did it or what happened, so why even report it? It's gone.
I guess
Whatever, I just give up. It's not...
That's more like lack of faith, right? Like you don't have faith that the system will work.
I wouldn't even say, I wouldn't say this, if somebody came up to me and took my wallet, there's no way they're gonna, by the time I get to go report it, especially like the 73, most people weren't carrying cell phones.
Yeah.
By the time you go and get to the police station to report it, that person's gone.
Yeah.
You're not getting your wallet back, so
Right.
what was the point of reporting a petty theft?
Right.
Or a mugging even in that case. You came out survived, you didn't have any injuries, what was the point?
Right.
You just moved on with your life.
But in that case, then the NCDS might catch you, and you would be like, oh yeah, somebody did steal my wallet, and I was really annoyed. And so, I see you're saying interpreting it as trust
It's
issue.
just a distrust in the
I got you.
legal system. It's not necessarily true. It's also just, the facts of your being, I say give you an impression of who's more realist, a optimist versus pessimist on the system, but not necessarily a trust issue.
Okay.
How do you view everything in general when you're just like,
Yeah.
I got it a lot, they lost my wallet, whatever, maybe they needed the money more.
It does say that that's actually part of the survey.
Right. Oh, asking if you trust.
Yeah, so if people are
Okay.
telling them,
Yeah, okay.
I don't trust the system.
Okay, that's different though.
And yes, though, I can see what you're saying, that people can also interpret things and call it lack of trust when what they're really talking about is
Something different.
pessimism or cynicism or whatever. Yeah, that's fair. But there is a specific question about trust. But I think
L'Oreal, the trust issue is a serious one,
it is.
Yes.
especially now in my community. Is very serious. You know what I mean? I worry about my grandchildren walking by themselves. We put them in private school because we're afraid. We have this fear now. We're not just fearing the society, the white society, but we are fearing who the people that are supposed to protect us.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. My son works downtown in Charlotte. He has an executive post. I worry about him leaving every morning. I worry about my granddaughter going to school and taking her child to school.
Yep.
It's a worry. You never see it because there's a lot of trust. In the 70s, I trust the police completely. Completely. I had some nasty neighbors that I didn't trust them when I came to Maine, but with time and my way of looking at things, I built that trust. Still friends up to this day. But as in general, even me, if I'm driving, I get stopped. I have everything at hand, and no, please don't shoot, please don't shoot, because it's a scary thing not to have trust. Those are people that I should trust, should protect my community. And yet, it's on
The media, right, yeah. Yep.
The media's taken a huge swing in the appearance of how they portray the police. In general, from 73, they were portrayed in a way that, barbers, hell, I trust my officer so much, I'll give him a free haircut. I respect them. Now it's, they're automatically, everything is automatically, before when the story first releases of anything, it's, the cop did this because they wanted to kill him. And then they backtrack 3 days later on some of the stories and say, oh, well, what really happened was this, but it's not, doesn't make the front page, because that story doesn't sell.
Right.
And so you don't see a lot of the
Positive stories.
You don't see a lot of the positive stories or the changes in the stories. And then even the positive stories now is, well, that's just a PR stunt. They don't do that normally.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that white officer playing basketball with a black guy, that's just a PR stunt. So he's been doing that for the 20 years he's been a cop.
Right. Sorry, Mimi, go ahead.
But they don't do that normally, but it happens every day.
It can, yes, it does.
It happens every day. And the problem is, I don't know who to trust. Do I trust the media? Do I trust the police? Do I trust my neighbors? I don't. I really don't.
It's not as clear anymore, for sure, yeah.
No, because I don't have any reason to trust the people that surround me.
Yeah.
It's not like back in the 70s that you could trust. Today's a different ball game. If you really look at it, let's see just what's going on, from last year to this year.
Right. So
It's horrendous.
Oh, yes. So I want to pause you here only because I want to talk more about this in the second half. We're going to talk about law enforcement specifically and the changing attitudes and counter movements and things like that. So I don't want to silence you, Mimi, but I want to pause you because we're going to talk about it again in a few minutes. Is that okay? All right. But I understand completely. So why don't we take a break here? When we come back, I'm going to talk about some of the theories of crime, and then we'll move on to talk about the criminal justice system as a whole. Does that make sense? So, all right. So I'll meet you guys back here in, let's say, 2:25. 2:25. Got it? All right. See you all in a little over 10 minutes. welcome back. Sorry for the delay there. We had a little announcement here for something going on in Augusta. So in the second half today, I want to talk about the theories of crime, and then we'll move on to talk about our criminal justice system and how it works and what some of the problems with it are. If we don't get to everything for some reason today, don't worry. I'll record a video of any part of the lecture I don't get to and post it right away, so everyone will have all the material before the exam. Just want to let people know that in advance, but hopefully we can get pretty close. Okay, so we can switch back to the computer, please. Thank you. The first theory, sociological theory of crime that I want to talk about is called conflict criminology. So if you took, it's critical criminology. It comes out of the conflict tradition in sociology. If you took intro sociology, you probably learned about the conflict perspective. Involved people like Karl Marx and everything. Anyway, this is not Marx himself, but people from that tradition developed was called critical criminology. And it comes from a branch of theory called critical theories, which does include, if some of you have ever read the news lately, something called critical race theory. But we are talking about critical criminology today, not the race one. There's a whole set of critical theories, which are theories about social structures constraining opportunities for individuals. Some critical theories focus on economic systems, others focus on racial or gender systems. There's lots of different kinds of critical theory in social science and in legal studies. What sociologists tend to focus on is the idea of intersectionality, and you probably heard this term before. Right? Intersectionality looks at the overlap between race, class, gender, age, sexuality, all the characteristics, demographic, kinds of components of a person. Intersectionality also views those in power in our different systems, right? And in particular, how those in power use the criminal justice system to maintain their power. So I'll continue this on the next slide. But the idea of critical theory is to look at how the structure, in this case it's criminal justice, structure of defining crime, whatever, can disproportionately affect people of different races, classes, genders, ages, sexualities, abilities, religions, and so on and so forth. So what critical criminology argues is that we criminalize the poor in our culture while ignoring the harmful acts of the wealthy. Someone mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the Part 1 and Part 2 crimes for the FBI, right? The Part 1s were less of violent crime. One of the Part 2 crimes I threw out there mentioning was embezzlement, right? Embezzlement is a crime more often committed by the wealthy, right? And dollar for dollar often is a very expensive crime compared to a crime of the poor, like shoplifting something, right, which could be a very small dollar amount. But we criminalize shoplifting and spend a lot more resources on stopping and punishing shoplifting than we do, corporate white-collar tax evasion, right? So, for example, street crimes versus white-collar crimes. We have very different ways of dealing with these kinds of crimes, which are more likely committed by the poor or by people who are racial or ethnic minorities or people who are very young or all sorts of demographic characteristics. As we know, racial minorities in particular are more likely to be policed, searched, arrested, tried, convicted, and receive longer sentences than white individuals and their experiences in the system. One example of this is the war on drugs, right? And the focus of the war on drugs initially on crack cocaine as opposed to powdered cocaine, right? Which chemically are the same chemical, right? But one preparation of that drug is much more commonly used by the poor and working class and people of color, whereas the other preparation of that drug is primarily used by wealthy white elites, right? And all of the resources of the war on drugs were focused on crack and very few on cocaine. In fact, there was, I have the statistic here, 100-to-1 difference in the sentencing between crack and powder cocaine cases. So people who were sentenced for crack cocaine had 100 times greater overall, sentences. Questions, comments? Speed. Oh.
Like prescription opiates.
It might be, so those kind of do different things, so they're different drugs, but I mean.
A lot of people who are more wealthy use prescription, whereas I don't afford them, whereas a lot of people can't.
Oh, I see, so it's heroin and opiates. Yes, I gotcha. Nope.
Yeah, look at the same place, so like, is he?
No, you're right, yes. Prescription opioid abuse versus heroin use, very different class. The economic class of the users is very different. Not exclusively, but more. Yes, exactly.
Like people,
Not so much. No.
You're kind of a dealer, dude.
Right.
Like you're dealing drugs to.
Yeah, not kind of.
It really happened. And you're a horrible person, and you're kind of walking away from this. But yeah, that guy that sold the dime bag on the corner is going to jail.
Correct. And part of that war on drugs, right, was busting for possession, solely for possession, right? When, arguably possession doesn't hurt anybody other than the person, and yet, trafficking, selling, all those other production, those that really fuel the system were not always as targeted, right? Because it's much easier to catch addicts than it is to attack the root problem. So, yeah. And that is a critical theory approach to understanding, why certain crimes are worse than others, right? So that's the critical approach. There is also a classical theory approach to crime. And the classical approach to crime views crime as a rational decision. That if people are committing crime, it's because the system made it too easy to do that thing. Oh, come on, it's kind of a cool approach, isn't it?
That's actually kind of cool, yeah.
That problems related to the criminal justice system are things that keep people from following the rules.
Because it's a crappy law, I'm not going to obey it.
Yeah, or because laws, that if a law is well written, it will keep people in line. Yeah. It's up to the system to make sure that when people do the math of like what they're going to do, when they make decisions, that it comes out in favor of following the law. Is that? Let me try to listen.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I agree with it.
Oh, and that's, that's allowed. Like, these are theories. There is evidence to support them, but it is one approach.
I didn't get it at first, but as soon as you said that, I thought,
Okay. No. All four of these theories that I'm presenting are open to proponents and detractors. Right? There are pros and cons for each one. So
that second bullet, is that where like civil disobedience would come in?
it could.
that's different. Yeah. I'm
It
talking
could.
about the part where you said that if the crime is good, like I was thinking prohibition, you need like a lot of things were right, like that.
We made a law that was very clear, but people still chose to break it. Well, so in that case, right, the idea is that the law was written poorly because people chose to break it. And so what the evidence there is that the law should have been rewritten. Or repealed, which it eventually was.
Well, I mean, like, say, for instance, the outright banning of alcohol, right?
Right.
If it's, the law can't be any clearer than that. Like, you know what I'm saying? So, like, how can you rewrite the law to get clearer other than increasing sentencing?
Well,
Seriously, that's when you start getting into that. And that kind of was what they did. They took industrial alcohols that were being that were allowed to be tapped that were safe to drink, and they started putting toxins in them to keep them from drinking it. And that's why today, a lot of chemistry, MSDS sheets say talk more about chemicals or stuff added.
Right.
Keep
I
people
love the
drinking.
glass of wine, but all with the wine or
It's-
I give up the glass of wine.
Yes, no alcohol allowed in the free
It's clear,
law,
yeah.
but it doesn't close any of the loopholes. Look at like the grape juice concentrate. If they had a brick of compressed grapes, and right on the package says, do not leave in a water in a cabinet for 30 days, because that would make wine, and that's illegal. There were so many loopholes around the laws that they had written, that the benefits of committing the crime were outweighing the consequences.
That's the idea, is that it's a cost-benefit analysis. And a good law is one that makes the math work out in favor of following it. And that when that doesn't happen, it blames the law, not the offender, and maybe that's the piece that's a little bit of a problem, and that's fair. That's fair, because it takes agency out of the picture, right? Individual, free will is not, other than the cost-benefit analysis. And is anybody truly a rational actor? I mean, given the assumption of the theory, though, it holds.
I don't agree at all.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, you don't agree with the premise.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and that is, like I said, that's fair. These are all different approaches. So we have critical theory, looking at the structural problems, especially that affect people of different demographics. We have classical theory, looking at the rational weighing of pros and cons. The third one is called social disorganization theory. And this is a structural theory in sociology that says it can be the case that entire neighborhoods can become prone to crime when they are subject to structural level issues such as poverty, low education, heterogeneity, transience, etc. I'll explain in a second. Entire neighborhoods can become prone to crime. So this theory was created out of something called the Chicago School in sociology. It came from the University of Chicago, from scholars there who were looking at Chicago, because that's where they lived. And what they found, right, is that crime rates were extremely high in certain neighborhoods and not in others. I think you can all picture that happening, right? So they wanted to know, what is it about these particular neighborhoods, right? What specifically makes these neighborhoods unique? And what they found is that there were 9 characteristics, of social disorganization. I'm not going to test you on them. In fact, we're not going to talk about them all. If you're interested, by the way, there's a class called Sociology of Deviance that I teach every fall, and we will go into detail on all these theories. You can also take criminology, which is also taught in the fall, and they go into detail on some of these theories. But anyway, some of the issues, right? So most of the neighborhoods that had high crime were poor neighborhoods. Probably not a surprise, right? People who are in poverty have more strain, right? They have more need, things like that. The neighborhoods had low education. They had heterogeneity, which means a lot of diversity, which means that people didn't interact with each other a lot because they were all very different from one another, right? So if you have a really close-knit community, it was less likely to have crime. Transience, in this case, just means there's constantly people moving in and out of the neighborhood. So like often neighborhoods that have a high level of immigration, like immigrants come to the country, they stay in this neighborhood until they get their feet under them and then move on, right? So people are like coming in and out of the neighborhood all the time. All of these kinds of characteristics led to a disorganized neighborhood. They're actually called transitional neighborhoods, I think. And that was a theory for why crime occurred, is because of all these structural features of certain neighborhoods. Does that kind of make sense as an argument? Right? Again, you don't have to know every single characteristic of a neighborhood, but. All right, last but not least is something called strain theory. I mentioned the word strain a second ago. I said people in poverty often have more economic strain. So strain occurs when people cannot succeed even while following the norms of society. Society says if you work hard, you're going to get the American dream. All you got to do is work hard. So somebody who works their butt off and is still in poverty or working poor or whatever, they're experiencing strain because society tells them they should have succeeded, and yet they don't have evidence of success, right? We experience strain when we can't achieve the cultural goal of success through the means that are available to us, through the institutionalized means that are available to us. For example, society tells us, we should want a car, right? Especially in northern New England, right? A car is a pretty general goal we're supposed to want, right? But just having a car isn't the goal, right? There's specific ways you're allowed to get a car, right? You could buy one, you could lease one, you could get one as a gift, you could build one out of spare parts, right? But you can't steal one, or you can't, manufacture your own, not meeting regulation vehicle and try to drive that around, right? There are only certain institutionalized means for achieving the goal of a car. So if you really want a car and you buy into that goal, and society says you should have a car, but you can't achieve it through any of the normal ways of doing it, you're more likely to turn to crime or deviance to achieve that goal. Right? And so, because you feel strain occurs when there's a mismatch between the goal you're supposed to have and the options for achieving it. Does that make sense? We've all felt strain before, I think, right? So, for studying purposes, there is a chart on page 184 of the textbook, lays out each of the 4 theories that I just described, tells you the problems that they believe cause crime, and how they kind of approach solutions. Page 184. I didn't put it on the slide, but 184 is where that is. If I find charts like this helpful, but if you don't, that's okay. You don't have to memorize it. So. I put 84. Oh, nice. Way to go, me. Any questions about any of these theories?
Okay, so I'm still kind of, I guess I'm still stuck on the classical, so I don't get it.
Okay.
So would this be like the president of the Philippines when he basically said that any drug dealers would be executed? Is this kind of what the idea is, that that would be a heavy punishment to help knock down?
To help make the math right.
Make the math. Is that what we're trying to say, basically? So.
Well, that's one way this can play out. Yeah, is a very harsh punishment.
We're talking about harsh punishment, maybe the one method of knocking you down, or.
You have to make the consequences outweigh the benefits.
Okay. I think I get that. Yep. I'm getting it now.
Okay.
I wasn't quite getting it before.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, that's good. Yeah. You have to make the consequences outweigh the benefits.
It's kind of like the argument with the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Death penalty is not a deterrent to people that
Have nothing else to lose. Yes. Yes.
So that's not an appropriate penalty for them because they don't care about it. They expect to die any day. So saying, if you get caught with this, it's going to be death penalty. Okay. That's the life I'm living. So
take the other side of the coin, which is our other major form of punishment is fining people. Guess who doesn't care about fines? Rich people. Right? Literally, I've heard rich people refer to parking tickets as their parking fee.
yeah, it's a parking fee.
Yeah, they'd rather just pay a parking ticket to park wherever they want because they can afford it. That's a parking fee for them, right? Whereas any of us, we do that. It's hundreds of bucks. We can't afford it. Then we end up with a bench warrant because we don't pay the fine, and suddenly now it's like an incarcerable offense, right?
Is that kind of like the idea of saying, if you were going to say change the system, it would be like saying instead of it being set fee of $100, you would say it's a percentage of your income.
So yes.
It's what Sweden is doing with day fines.
Yeah.
It's just based on your income. So rich people.
So it would actually affect you more.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Now I think I got a good grasp.
At least the logic of it, even if you aren't
I
100% in agreement.
I agree a little more. I did at first because I wasn't. Okay.
No, that's. Thank you for admitting you don't get it out loud because I think other students, things don't always make sense, right? So it's cool. Yeah.
With string theory,
Mm-hmm.
is that counted by your surroundings?
What do you mean?
I can't afford this, following traditional needs, but all these people that I'm watching not follow those needs, they're getting it. Is that going to make that desire more?
I don't think they
Like if
count.
you're surrounded by people that aren't following
Okay,
the norms, is that going to make you more likely to commit the crime?
Yes, so there's two, so the original strain theory that was developed in the 60s or whatever didn't address that, but then in the 70s they expanded it. So general strain theory, the old one, this is way more detail than you need, but didn't really, they just said you're either strained or you're not strained and you have these outcomes. But future theorists elaborated on that, and so there's something called vicarious strain too. If you watch someone else being strained and you feel, and you're close to them, like you can feel it for them too, right? Or there's experience strain that you personally experience. So yes, they do address it, but not if you look up the original theory.
Okay, so it's kind of like the concept of taking up. The strain is
It
could
could.
keeping up with people around you.
Steroids in baseball.
Yeah, it's like,
well, that's what
it's keeping up with the system. Yeah, keeping up with the society.
My neighbor just got the steroids, big screen TV. I want to have a big screen TV kind of thing.
Kind of. If society's the one saying you should want this big screen TV, then yes. You know, if the message, if the larger message is you should have it, whether this other person's got it, right, then yes. Yep. Good questions. Any others about the theories for now? And again, if you'd like, next week during the review time, I'll go over it again. I'm happy to try to say it in new words or try, once it sinks in a little for you. And for anyone who can't attend the review session next week, I will record it and post it to Brightspace if there is one, if anybody shows up and wants to talk. But for now, the last thing I want to touch on today is our system, the criminal justice system. So, I mean, we've kind of already talked about it in its various forms a bit, but I want to formalize that a little. So, the criminal justice system in our culture, in our society, is both a source of social problems. It's not perfect, as we are well aware. But it also is an illustration of one of our responses to social problems, right? We created this system to help us deal with the social problem of crime. The book describes something that they call the criminal justice funnel, which is the idea that if you look at all the crime that's committed in a day or a week or a month, right, that's a lot of stuff. And then at each stage of our criminal justice system, things get narrowed down like a funnel. So through the steps of the criminal justice system are things like police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections. And these are the four elements that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But in terms of the funnel, the image here, I should have put it next to these four things, but it looks like this, right? Where here's all the crime that's committed, but as we know, only a portion of the crime that's committed is actually reported, right? And of the reported crimes, only so many of them result in arrests. And of those arrests, only so many result in prosecution and conviction and prison, right? So at all levels of the criminal justice system, we're kind of narrowing down who is involved. So even using the term criminal justice system is a little bit of a misnomer because it makes it sound like it's all connected and clearly defined. But federal versus state versus counties, there's no single cohesive system, right? And a low-level felony in one state could be just a misdemeanor in another state. And because it's haphazard in that way, we live in 50 states, meaning every state has their own system. They don't always match up, and that can result in unjust outcomes. Never mind like race and class and all that playing a role. If you happen to get caught on the wrong side of a border, doing the state border, doing the same activity, right? That's unjust if the same behavior one place earns you a punishment and not another. So I want to focus on the concepts of criminalization and decriminalization. Criminalization is the process of defining an action or a person as a criminal by creating a law. The very first slide today, when I defined crime, an intentional act, blah, 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 right? And we were asking about, what does intentional mean and all that? The idea there was that something can't be a crime until we as a society define it as a crime, right? And so that process is called criminalization. For example, the HIV non-disclosure laws make it a crime for a person who's HIV positive to engage in sexual behavior with another person without disclosing their status, right? What had been a public health issue until a certain amount, I don't remember what year it was implemented, but what had been a public health issue became a criminal justice issue with the advent of that law, right? It took it from just a health thing to a legal thing. That's the criminalization of something. On the other hand, decriminalization is the process of changing a law so an action is no longer considered to be a criminal offense. Incidentally, and I'll leave this up, that is not the same thing as legalization. Something can be decriminalized but not legalized. So the decriminalization is the process of changing the law so that an action is no longer considered a criminal offense. In decriminalization, something that was once seen as a social problem becomes regarded as a non-criminal issue, right? So at various times in history, alcohol consumption, right, during Prohibition, was considered something that was illegal and has been decriminalized. It also was legalized, but marijuana is another one, at least at state levels, has been decriminalized, but only in a few states has it been actually legalized. The difference, so possessing small amount of marijuana for personal use is no longer considered it no longer incurs a criminal penalty, right? And so that's decriminalization. But setting up a system where the production and use of marijuana is taxed and regulated, right, that's legalization. So there can be a situation where something's been decriminalized but hasn't been legalized. Does that make sense? And whatever you're talking about, criminalizing something or decriminalizing something, it's always a reflection of society's moral values. Moral views. Take Prohibition, for example, right? The Women's Christian Temperance Union had a very strong moral view that alcohol was killing society, and so the criminalization of alcohol, right, in the late 1920s or whatever, was a process of criminalization resulting from moral views. Of course, society changed those views pretty rapidly after that, and then that resulted in decriminalization and legalization of alcohol. Re-legalization? I don't know.
So, I guess the issue I'm seeing is moral views. Is people still, that seems like it's changing. It's saying that the change in the mores of society is affecting the law. Mm-hmm. I would say that, like, for instance, they just decriminalized in Oregon all moves. That seems like the mores didn't change. People still find it wrong to perform them, but they just think the act of criminalizing it is wrong.
So that's the moral view there, though, is that the punishment for the crime is the problem, is the moral objection.
Okay.
I think people are changing substance abuse disorders and actual struggle. They don't want to be criminal.
I guess the issue I have is they still find the act wrong. So it's not like...
But it's been redefined as a medical issue and no longer a legal issue.
That's where the moral changes come from, is that it's not considered a moral failing to be a drug addict, it's considered a medical issue.
And I think as a society, we realize that criminalizing
Isn't solving the problem.
If we're talking
That's
about...
what I was more leaning towards, is that it feels like it's not really solving the moral issue. For most people that legalize it, it's not because of the medical. It's because they just don't think the crime is right.
That's,
setting it as a crime.
and that's the moral shift.
That's the shift, yeah.
It's not so much about whether or not you think drugs are okay or using them is okay. It's about whether or not you think the punishment is okay. That's the
What I
one.
would argue is that for some people, it's not really a shift in changing of whether or not the crime, whether it should be criminal or not. Is that making it criminal doesn't work. So what's the point in removing that? If people, because they could have potentially more success in a different route.
True. If this said criminalization and decriminalization can reflect changing moral values, would that be okay to you? Because I think I just misrepresented it here.
Yeah, because I get it's a huge, I get most of the time there is moral change. But there's cases where I could see where you decriminalize something, not saying necessarily like alcohol. The funny is, those people didn't change their moral opinion on what alcohol was. They just said, prohibition doesn't work, we made it worse. Now we have organized crime, we have all those other issues that came up because of it. We might as well, make it legal again so we can regulate it.
Yeah.
And try to control it in a better way. But they didn't change their moral view. They still viewed it as evil and the root of failing of family and all this other stuff. And so the temperance movement didn't disappear just because of that. They changed their approach on how they wanted to regulate it.
Right. So I would say that's a fair critique, and that is more my thing than like the book or theory or whatever. That I would say if it works for you, criminalization and decriminalization can and often do, but not always, reflect changing moral views. That's fair and reasonable. Any other questions or comments about criminalization or decriminalization? All right. Next up are different types of offenses, and this is where I again reiterate that I am not a legal scholar, but I have a grasp on this. But so 2 Latin terms that I do want you to kind of know the difference of. Criminal offenses can either be classified as mala in se or mala prohibita. And if you ever saw the movie Legally Blonde, there's even a scene where they talk about this. But anyway, so mala in se are crimes that are, now the word morally here is kind of used as a metaphor or whatever, like crimes that are...
I feel more towards the one line of what I was thinking.
Yeah, where we're seen as like, it is the wrong thing to do. You can't hurt another person. You can't do these things, right? And so these are things that are morally wrong regardless of whether they're criminalized. Mala prohibita are the technicalities, right? They're the things that are regarded as wrong simply because they're criminalized. Literally, the Latin works out to wrong in and of itself, and wrong because it's prohibited, right? So these are things that, we have decided should be rules, and if you break them, you're committing an offense, but we are not like vested in the morality of why you broke them. These are things that we see as just, not technically wrong, but truly wrong, right, in some form. The other distinction that's often made with crime is felonies and misdemeanors. You've probably heard those terms before, right? Felonies, of course, are the more serious offenses that result in prison terms, usually of a year or longer. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, are the less serious offenses. Usually those are punishable by up to 1 year in a jail, a county jail or a city jail. That's not perfect across the board, especially because of overcrowding and understaffing and things. And mass incarceration. There's a lot of people who are, don't fit one of these categories neatly for their punishment, even if their crime is literally a felony or a misdemeanor. But usually misdemeanors can also include, it doesn't have to be incarceration. It can be things like fines, community service, probation, and that kind of thing too.
Like mala prohibita was like what we were talking about before with like
yeah, going 31 and a 30, that's mala prohibita.
And then mala in se would be like
going 50 and a 30.
Well, I would say like incest.
Yeah, well, yes, that too.
In other cases, it's not. But we all think it's wrong. Most of society thinks it's wrong.
But yes.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes. So right, 31 and a 30, it is wrong. You shouldn't do it, right? But is it, does anyone really invest a lot of time and moral energy in it? Probably not. Right. These things are wrong, whether or not.
Whether they're criminalized or not.
Yeah.
The society says they're wrong.
Yeah. Good. And felonies, misdemeanors make sense. Again, that's pretty well known in regular culture, but. All right, so that's the legal part of where the laws come from. The next stage in the criminal justice system, once a law has been broken, or even to prevent that from happening, but is the institution of policing. So policing is, sort of the first point of entry into the criminal justice system for most people. If you encounter the criminal justice system, it's through police. Not always, but, and this is where I want to bring back what Mimi was talking about before the break. So there are social movements out there, both Black Lives Matter and then the counter movement of Blue Lives Matter, illustrating that there is a battle to define the social problems of policing. Black Lives Matter, of course, is a movement critical of police practices that disproportionately affect African Americans and people of color. And then Blue Lives Matter was sort of a counter movement that seeks to frame violence against police as the primary concern, right, and the dangers faced by officers. I don't care which side of this you come down on. It doesn't actually matter. I'm just trying to show that there is a social debate, right, or at least a fight socially to be the one whose definition of policing is the loudest and the one that is the most accepted by others, right? It's bad, it's good, it's whatever, right? These movements are somewhat new in the last decade or so. Battles to define the things that are good or bad in society are ongoing for all time. This is the current one, but so let's talk about what law enforcement officers have to do, right? So their job is to respond to social problems, and those can often extend beyond crime. We know that the police are the first responders often called for mental health emergencies, for families in crisis, for things that have zero legal implications even. And so, interacting with people who are in crisis, especially when guns are accessible, right, or weapons of any kind, but put police in harm's way. And that can be very dangerous. And so police are more likely than many other fields of employ, not all, but many, to have work-related injuries. That can include, the normal kinds of work-related injuries like, accidents or back problems from a bad chair at your desk or whatever. But it can also include things like assault, occupational stress, compassion fatigue, depression, burnout, right? All these kinds of activities. And regardless of your opinion on the entire institution of policing, it is true that individual police officers face significant stress and what do I want to say, danger, I suppose, in the workplace. To combat some of that, police departments have tried to create programs, things like mindfulness training that helps with stress and compassion fatigue and burnout, improved training and resources for de-escalation, crisis intervention, things like that. There is, of course, also part of one of the movements is to eliminate the need for police to solve these kinds of non-crime related issues and to deploy people like social workers or crisis specialists or other kinds of first responders to deal with some of the non-criminal aspects that police have often been required to participate in. Does that make sense? Questions or comments for now? We've got a little more, but so historically, there's more than two theories of policing, but there's two that I'm going to present to you, right? Which is sort of the old way and how things are starting to change. The old model of policing was characterized by a philosophy called broken windows. Broken windows policing is the argument that disorder, a neighborhood with broken windows, with graffiti, with littering, with panhandling, right? Disorder is a social problem that reduces quality of life for residents and contributes to serious violent crime. So you remember that social disorganization theory from before, right? That certain neighborhoods have these demographics that make them more prone to crime. So that was a sociologist out of Chicago. But then the law enforcement, I don't want to say industry, the law enforcement world, whatever, took that theory and produced this kind of approach, which is, okay, so if social disorganization is causing crime, then maybe a solution for policing is to focus on that disorder. And if we get rid of the disorder, we can get rid of the crime. Unfortunately, that doesn't work, right? So what ends up happening is police get framed as aggressive order maintenance people. That they're aggressively trying to maintain order. So proponents of broken window policing say that police can disrupt the process of crime by focusing on this kind of petty stuff like littering and graffiti and whatever, to make people feel like they're more invested in their neighborhood and they're prouder of it, and then they won't want to commit crime in it. The problem is that the tactics that most police departments used to engage in broken windows policing, and this we're talking like the early 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And 70s, we'll not throw them in too. But anyway, the problem with broken windows policing is that the tactics police were using created even worse problems, right? Because where are the places with broken windows and graffiti and litter more likely to be? Poorer neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods with a lot of diversity. And so all these misdemeanor, charges of littering and citations for whatever, right, failure to maintain, the property or whatever, caused all these arrests and citations and fines of a community that's already low income, struggling. If they could fix the broken window, they would have fixed the broken window, right? It's cold. But, and that strained the relationship between the community and the police that were meant to serve the community and created an us versus them, right? The cops start to get us. They're going to find us for not having a horse hitch in front of the bar, even though we're, doing the best we can, right? Not your case exactly, but the other problem with broken windows policing is that disorder is in the eye of the beholder, right? One person's graffiti is another person's street mural, art. Who's to say what's a ticket-worthy offense, right? Resentments build in a community when the kinds of things that are characteristic of African American or Latino or indigenous people's culture gets treated as disorderly by the police, right? Loud music, again, different kinds of art. I'm always thinking of noise complaints as a version of this, right? That, one person's noise is another person's cultural celebration, music, art, whatever, right? And so, who are the police to say that something is disorderly when the neighborhood's fine with it or whatever? Does this concept, broken windows policing, make sense and why it was kind of problematic? So the modern approach, or at least the newer approach to policing, is one that embraces something called community policing, where the police aren't pitted against the residents of a neighborhood. Instead, the police and the public are meant to be partners in preventing crime, right? Community policing involves like having more like outposts, like police offices, right? So like in every neighborhood there is an officer or several who live in the neighborhood, who work in the neighborhood, who get to know everyone, right? And they become invested in the community because they are a part of the community. It gives the citizens in those communities a voice and treats them with dignity and respect. And this is achieved through increased contact with residents, partnering with neighborhood organizations, and a solution-oriented approach. I'll let you write that down. There is, in social science, something called the contact hypothesis that says that the more time you spend with a person, the more you end up liking that person.
So this is where I'm going to end this. Thank you for listening.